Rhys Thorne walked through the sliding doors of Harborview Medical Center's emergency wing, expecting chaos. What he found was something far worse. It was 2:17 in the morning. A thin, cold rain kept falling over Alaskan Way outside, the kind that never announced itself, just settled into the skin and stayed there. Two bodyguards moved in behind him, their jackets stiff with dried blood gunpowder still clinging to the fabric. He was the young Mafia boss of the Thorne family, and he'd walked into enough mass casualty scenes to know exactly what he expected. Monitors screaming, gurneys crashing into walls, the particular music of chaos he'd heard more times than he wanted to count. Instead, he found silence. 57 victims lay stable across beds and rolling carts lining the corridor 3 deep. Monitors beeped in steady, even rhythms. Not one of them was dying. Nurses and aides stood slumped against the walls, scrubs stiff with blood dried hours ago, their eyes hollow with the particular blankness of people who'd spent the night doing more than any training had prepared them for. Rhys stopped in the middle of the corridor. His voice, when it came, was low and precise. "Who kept all of them alive?" No one answered right away. The silence stretched, thickening until it felt like something that could be touched. Isla Monroe, a young nurse with hands still trembling, lifted her head. She didn't dare meet his eyes. She only pointed toward the west exit, her voice barely more than breath. The nurse who got suspended this morning." Rhys turned his head toward the door. Something in his eyes went dark and stayed dark. He walked toward it, his bodyguards falling into step behind him without a word. Outside, the exit sitting alone in the rain, a small cardboard box waited on the wet pavement, one corner already soaked through. When Rhys crouched to lift it, the bodyguard nearest him leaned in, his voice pitched low enough that only his boss could hear. "Boss, 3 years ago, a woman in a dark alley left behind a note. Same handwriting as this box. I kept it." Rhys said nothing. His fingers tightened around the edge of the box until his knuckles went white. He opened the lid in the rain. Inside sat a cracked porcelain cup, an old photograph of a gray-haired man, and a plain silver ring. He closed the lid and turned back toward the hospital doors, the box held against his chest like something that mattered more than anyone around him understood. He'd braced for a war zone tonight. He'd found something closer to sacred. And 5 words wouldn't stop replaying behind him, the nurse who got suspended this morning. Rhys looked out through the rain-streaked window at the darkness beyond the parking lot, and something cold moved through his chest. Someone had known she would be here tonight. Someone had planned around her before he'd ever walked through those doors. If you've ever been the one who did everything right and still got punished for it, stay with this story. It only gets heavier from here. Earlier that same day, 7:42 a.m., Wren Solace had been summoned to the closed-door office of Harlan Pike, chief of the emergency department. 2 security guards stood outside before she'd even reached the door, which told her everything about how this meeting would go. Pike sat behind his desk and didn't offer her a chair. He slid a suspension form across the surface, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Breach of chain of command. You moved a patient into surgery without my signature." That patient had lived. Pike signed the suspension anyway without hesitation, as if the outcome were irrelevant to the process. While he signed, he let his eyes travel over her, slow and deliberate, before smirking in front of the room. "With a body like that, you'd be better suited at the front desk comforting families, not standing in a room where lives are saved. You're lucky I've had the patience not to let you go in your first month." Wren didn't bow her head. She didn't cry. She didn't argue at length. She looked Pike directly in the eyes and said in a voice that stayed even and clear, "The patient lived. That's enough." She unclipped her badge and set it on the desk, then walked to her locker for the small cardboard box waiting inside the cracked cup. The photograph, the silver ring. It would be easy to believe Pike's cruelty was only the cost of doing dirty business for someone else. It wasn't. Long before anyone had paid him $1, Harlan Pike had already decided a woman built like Wren didn't belong in the room where lives were saved. The bribe he'd take by evening didn't create that contempt, it only rented it. As she walked out, an elderly janitor pressed something small into her palm wrapped in a damp paper towel. A USB drive. He spoke only one sentence before disappearing into the elevator. "I clean his office every night. There's something on here he forgot to delete." Wren slipped the drive into her inner jacket pocket without opening it. Further down the hall, a nurse spoke just loud enough for her to catch it as she passed. "Pike's been saying it for a week now. That Solace girl working night shifts is going to ruin everything." Wren walked out into the rain. She set the box on the hood of her car and stood there a moment, the cold mist settling over her shoulders. She thought back to the case that morning, a patient with signs of a swapped muscle relaxant, a poison that only ever surfaced in the underworld's private purges. She had reported it. She had been silenced with a suspension form before the ink was dry. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a siren rose, growing louder with every second. Wren turned her head. A convoy bearing the Thorne family crest tore through the hospital gates. She looked down at the box and understood something she hadn't expected to that morning. The man who'd just thrown her out was more afraid of her than he'd ever been of any rival. If you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Keep watching the next few minutes change everything you think you understand about power in this hospital. Wren set the box beside her tire and walked back through the staff entrance. The same guard who'd escorted her out that morning only stepped aside silent. Inside the emergency department had become a battlefield. Gurneys stacked against each other. Blood and rainwater pooled across the floor. The doctor on duty was triaging by order of arrival, entirely wrong for a scene of this scale. Wren didn't ask permission. She simply began to move. In 17 minutes, she sorted the wounded into 3 groups, those who needed blood immediately, those who could wait, and those quietly dying, because no one had noticed how silent they'd gone. One of the quietest was Rhys Thorne, the Mafia boss's younger half-brother. A young doctor rushed toward her, throwing up a hand to block her path, his voice raised for the whole ward to hear. "You don't have authority here anymore! Don't make everyone pity your ego!" Wren didn't look at him. She pointed at the monitor of the patient in the corner and said one sentence, her voice cold and final. "He'll go into cardiac arrest in 4 minutes, if his chest isn't opened right now." The clock ran. Exactly 4 minutes later, the heart rate line on the monitor flattened. The ward froze, then broke into motion, Wren already moving with the crash cart, calling out compressions in a voice that didn't shake. 90 seconds later, the line found its rhythm again. The patient's chest rose on its own. The young doctor stood very still, the color draining slowly from his face. Rhys appeared at the door in that exact moment, his coat soaked with rain and blood. A wounded bodyguard, held up by 2 others, caught sight of Wren's face. He straightened himself and called out her name. Not the name on her badge, but an old one, buried since she was 19. The kind of name only someone once pulled back from death could remember to say. The whole hallway went still. If watching a woman get humiliated and then proven right in the same hour made your blood boil the way it's supposed to, stay with me. This story is just getting started. The stillness broke into motion again, but something in the air had shifted, and everyone in that corridor felt it. Rhys crossed the distance to the gurney in a handful of steps. He watched the way Wren tied off a tourniquet in one continuous motion, a particular twist of the wrist, a specific angle of pressure. It was the exact technique of the ghost medic, the unnamed nurse who had saved at least 7 Thorne family members over 3 years, without ever leaving her name behind. He said nothing yet. He only watched. The young doctor who'd called her out earlier stood frozen near the wall, his face still pale from what he'd just seen. Rhys stepped into the middle of the ward. His voice low, still carried to every corner of the room. "The woman you just tried to stop is the reason my brother and 56 other people are still breathing tonight. If anyone in this building disrespects her again, they won't have a place left in this city." Harlan Pike, who'd been moving to reassert some control, stopped completely. His face went pale. He turned away, phone already at his ear, murmuring low, "She's back. Handle it now." Rhys watched Pike's retreating back and understood something colder than anything he'd felt all night. That phone call wasn't about handling one suspended nurse. It was a signal for something far larger than the chaos in this ward. If you've ever watched a cruel person's whole world start to crumble in real time, you already know this is only the beginning. Rhys didn't leave that night. He stood at the edge of the ward for hours, watching Wren move from bed to bed with the same unhurried precision, never raising her voice, never once looking for approval. He thought of the box in his car, the ring, the photograph. 3 years of unanswered questions circling closer to an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to hold. By early afternoon, the worst of it had passed. Wren finally sat down on an overturned supply crate, her hands shaking now that nothing demanded them to be steady. She thought of her father, the man who'd disappeared from her life at 17, leaving behind a debt she'd never understood and a silver ring that was the only thing of him she still had. Rhys Thorne, pale but conscious, caught his brother's sleeve as an orderly wheeled him toward recovery. "Rhys, 3 years ago the note that woman left in the alley had a string of numbers on it. That string is what let you avoid the ambush last August. She protected our family and never even knew our names." Rhys said nothing. He only looked over his shoulder back toward the nurse's station, where Wren sat with her hands folded in her lap. Harlan Pike had not gone far. He stood in a stairwell 3 floors up, his voice a hushed, frantic whisper into his phone. "I told you the timing wasn't my fault. She wasn't supposed to still be in the building when the convoy arrived. I signed the suspension before 8 exactly like you asked." A pause. Whatever came back through that phone made his already pale face go the color of old paper. "I understand. I'll fix it. Give me until tonight." He straightened his tie and descended the stairs as though nothing at all had happened, not knowing that Rhys's people, who had quietly suspected a leak inside the hospital for weeks, had already placed a listening device on the line he'd just used. Wren rose from the crate and walked to the break room, intending only to splash water on her face. She hadn't expected anyone to be waiting there. Rhys stood near the window, his coat finally dry. "You're the one from the convoy," she said, not a question. "Rhys Thorne." He said it plainly, without the weight most people gave the name. "I know who you are," Wren said. "Everyone in this hospital does." "Then you know I don't waste time." He studied her. 3 years ago, someone left a note in an alley on the east side, a string of numbers. It saved my brother's life last August and mine before that. I've spent 3 years trying to find whoever wrote it. Wren's jaw tightened just slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I think you do." His voice didn't rise. "The Garrett knot, the way you check pupils, the ring you're still wearing even after they took your badge." A pause. "You're the one they call the ghost medic." "The patient lived," Wren said quietly. "That's all that should matter to anyone." "It matters to me," Rhys said, "that 57 people are alive tonight because of you, and that the man who runs this hospital tried to make sure you weren't here to save them." She thought her secret had stayed buried for 3 years. She was wrong, and the man standing in front of her now was about to make sure it couldn't stay buried any longer. Before Wren could answer, a nurse burst into the break room, breathless. "Miss Solace, administration wants you back upstairs, now." Wren exchanged a brief, wordless glance with Rhys before following the nurse out, Rhys close behind her. What Harlan Pike didn't know was that the phone call he'd just made had already been recorded, and the man walking into that meeting with Wren Solace was about to make sure everyone heard it. Pike signed away a nurse's career the same morning he sold out an entire convoy to buy his own comfort. Some of you will say he's a coward who deserves to lose everything. Others will say a man that scared of losing his job is still a victim of the same broken system. Pick a side in the comments, coward or casualty, and tell me why. Because by the end of this video, one of you is going to change your mind. The third-floor conference room looked nothing like Pike's private office, larger, formal, meant for department heads, not a suspended night nurse and the man whose family owned half the piers on the Seattle waterfront. Pike straightened when he saw who had come with her. "Mr. Thorne, this is an internal hospital matter." 57 people who are alive tonight concern me, Rhys said, and every one of them is alive because of the woman you suspended this morning. Pike's mouth tightened. He turned to Wren instead. "Miss Solace, you understand the position this puts me in. The board will want an explanation." "The board will want an explanation," Wren said evenly, "for why the chief of this department suspended the only nurse capable of running mass triage on the morning a convoy of gunshot victims arrived. I'd start preparing that answer." Isla Monroe stepped into the doorway, her hands still trembling. "I heard Mr. Pike on the phone last month. He said not to let Wren near any patient connected to the Thorne family. He used her old name. This morning, before the convoy even arrived, he told someone she needed to be suspended before 8 a.m. He said if she was still in the building when the convoy came, the plan would fall apart." The room went very quiet. Rhys set his phone on the table screen up. "This is audio from a line my own people have been monitoring for weeks. We suspected a leak in this hospital long before tonight." He pressed play. Pike's own voice filled the room. "I understand. I'll fix it. Give me until tonight." "Fix what, exactly?" Rhys asked quietly. "Fix the fact that the nurse you tried to remove ended up saving my brother's life anyway?" Pike's hands trembled as he reached for his glasses. "This recording proves nothing. I have no obligation to explain private." "You have every obligation," Rhys said, "to explain why you took money to make sure a specific nurse wasn't in this building on a specific morning." Wren watched Pike's composure crack and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, but a quiet, exhausted relief. "I don't need an apology," she said finally. "I need my suspension lifted so I can go back to work. That's all I've ever asked for." "You'll have it," Rhys said. "Tonight." Pike, sensing the ground slipping away, made one last attempt. "She comes from the underworld," he said, his voice rising. "Her father worked for criminals. She can't be trusted." "The woman you just called untrustworthy," Rhys said, stepping between them, "just saved 57 lives. You are the man who took money to put them at risk. Explain that." Pike opened his mouth. No words came. The board chair summoned during the commotion arrived just in time to hear it. She looked between Pike's ashen face and Wren's quiet composure. "Mr. Pike," she said slowly, "I think we need a very different conversation than the one you were expecting today." Pike walked out without another word. His shoulders hunched, a man who'd spent his whole career hiding behind a title, finally left standing with nothing behind him at all. Pike was never driven by greed alone. Greed was only the door money walked through. What he really wanted was to never again feel as small as he must have felt once, standing somewhere without a title to hide behind. Humiliating Wren wasn't strategy. It was rehearsal for a fear he never let anyone see, and the recording didn't just expose a bribe, it exposed a man who'd built his entire authority on making sure no one beneath him ever felt safe enough to stop shrinking. Nothing satisfies an audience more than watching a bully's own recorded words become the evidence that destroys him. But Pike had no idea this recording was only the smallest fraction of what was about to come undone. Once the room cleared, Rhys turned to Wren, his voice lower now. "There's more to this than a suspension. I think you already know that." "The USB," Wren said. He nodded once. "I think it's time you told me what you know about your father." "Not here," she said. "Not like this." "Then when? When I'm not standing in a hallway wondering if I still have a job." Something in his expression eased, not quite a smile, but close. Near midnight, as Wren returned to the nurse's station with her badge restored, Pike's phone, left behind on the conference table in his rush to leave, buzzed once more. Isla, still standing nearby, glanced at the screen without meaning to. "An unknown number, one line. She's back. Handle it now before it's too late." Pike's own words echoed straight back at him from whoever he'd been reporting to. Isla's breath caught. He thought that call was the end of his problems tonight. He had no idea it was about to become someone else's excuse to move faster than anyone in that hospital was ready for. Late afternoon light through the ward's high windows had turned the color of cold brass. Only one ventilator remained. 2 critical patients lay side by side, one of Rhys's most loyal bodyguards and a man bearing rival family tattoos slipping in and out of consciousness. The machine's steady hiss and click filled the space where words should have been. Somewhere behind Wren, an IV bag ticked out its slow rhythm, drop by drop, and the smell of iodine and old rain still clung to everyone in the room. Wren stood between the 2 beds. She studied breathing, skin color, pupil response, 10 seconds, no more. Her fingers didn't shake anymore. That steadiness had cost her something across the last 12 hours, and she would feel the bill for it tomorrow, but right now, it held. She pointed to the bodyguard. "The ventilator goes to him." No one objected. Trust had been built decision by decision all night. As she adjusted the tubing, Rhys stood a few steps away and noticed for the first time the small things. The way she checked pupils at a particular angle, the way she counted respiration without a clock, the old silver ring she still wore, even after everything taken from her that day. These small, unremarkable things told him she was not ordinary in the way the world had spent her whole career insisting she was. He thought briefly of a night, 3 years earlier, a note folded twice, tucked under a windshield wiper in the rain. A string of numbers that had rerouted a convoy 40 minutes before an ambush would have caught it in the open. He'd spent 3 years imagining the person who wrote it as someone older, someone hardened, someone who moved through the underworld the way he did. He had never once pictured a woman, standing this close to exhaustion and still choosing every 10 seconds who got to live. A nurse cutting away the rival patient's clothing paused. "There's an envelope. It's heavy." The envelope reached Rhys's hands. His thumb hesitated a half-second on the flap, the same hesitation he remembered from opening the cardboard box outside the emergency doors that morning. Inside, cash and a folded scrap of paper, written 2 days earlier, in handwriting his people recognized from prior intercepted communications. "Suspend Solace before 8 a.m. If the girl is still there when the convoy arrives, the plan falls apart." His jaw set hard. This had never been an ordinary act of cruelty. Pike's decision to suspend her had been the opening move of a coordinated ambush meant to destroy the entire convoy, engineered from outside these walls, with Pike serving as a paid instrument for a hatred he already carried. It wasn't difficult to guess where that hatred had first taken root. 2 years before any bribe ever reached him, Pike had lost the chief position to a woman with better outcomes and less patience for his opinions. He'd told colleagues at the time that the board had made an emotional decision. He never said what he meant by that word. He hadn't needed to. The men outside the hospital who wanted Wren gone hadn't created Pike's contempt for women like her. They had simply found it already loaded, and offered to pull the trigger for a price. He found Wren and held the paper out without a word. She read it, her expression unreadable to a stranger, but Rhys had learned the small, careful economy of her face by now, and he saw something behind her eyes go cold and still. "They planned this," she said, "before any of it happened." "Yes." "They wanted me out specifically so the ambush would work." "Yes." Her hand found the edge of the gurney rail and gripped it, not for balance, but because it was something solid in a moment that had stopped feeling solid at all. She thought distantly of the stranger who'd lingered outside the hospital parking structure 2 mornings ago, a man with a phone raised, too long, too still, who she'd dismissed as a family member taking photos of a loved one's window. She hadn't thought of him again until this exact second. The nurse called out again, this time holding the rival's phone. "There's more! You need to see this!" Rhys scrolled through a folder of surveillance photographs, Wren taken from a distance, some clearly 3 years old. The same dark alley visible in the background of one shot. Each was labeled the same way. Priority target eliminate first. "They haven't only been hunting my family," he said. "They've been hunting you. Long before tonight." Wren stared at the images, her breath catching for the first time all day. She'd told herself for 3 years the alley was behind her. She understood now it had never stopped watching her, not for a single day. Rhys's voice, when it came again, had dropped lower, not the voice of a boss issuing an order, but something quieter, almost unfamiliar to his own ear. "I need you to eat something and sit down for 10 minutes. Not because I'm asking as Rhys Thorne, because I watched you hold a scalpel steady for 6 hours straight, and I don't trust my own men to notice when a person is running on nothing." Wren almost laughed, a short, surprised breath more than a laugh. "That's the first order you've given me all night that I actually plan on following." For 3 years, Rhys had told himself he was chasing a debt, a name, a face, a way to repay what the ghost medic had done for his family. Standing here now, phone shaking slightly in his hand, he understood the hunt had never really been about repayment. It was about control, the one thing a Mafia boss could never afford to lose, and the terrifying discovery that the person he needed most in this war was someone he could not simply command to stay safe. Protecting her was the easy part. Admitting he needed her, not as a debt repaid, but as a person he couldn't stand to lose, was the part that frightened him more than any rival family ever had. Harlan Pike, lingering near the doorway for one last desperate attempt at authority, saw the phone in Rhys's hand. "She comes from that world," he said, his voice cracking. "Her father worked for criminals his whole life. The woman you just called untrustworthy," Rhys said, "is the reason your hospital isn't counting 57 bodies tonight instead of 57 survivors. You are the man who took money to help murder them. Explain yourself, now." Pike had nothing. Security arrived and walked him out, his gold-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose one final time before the elevator closed on him. Isla's phone buzzed in the sudden quiet. She read it and went pale. "Unknown number. Again. It says Pike's sister has been sending hospital files to someone outside since last night." Rhys and Wren exchanged a glance. "His own blood," Rhys said slowly, "is the one turning against him. Betrayal from someone you trusted without question cuts in a way no outside enemy ever could. And Harlan Pike was about to learn that lesson from the one direction he never thought to guard." Wren looked down at the cash sitting on the counter and understood, with a cold and settling clarity, the full shape of what had happened to her. She hadn't only been humiliated and vindicated over one long night. She had been marked as a target, months or years before any of this began, and surviving tonight had only been the opening move of a war that had been waiting to happen with or without her knowledge. She thought unexpectedly of the note the janitor had pressed into her palm that morning. There's something on here he forgot to delete, and wondered for the first time whether that old man had known more about what was coming than a hospital janitor should ever have known. It was a small thought, easy to lose in everything else. She didn't lose it. She had walked into this hospital that morning believing the worst thing that could happen was losing her job. By nightfall, she understood that losing her job had been the smallest danger circling her all along, and the largest one hadn't shown its face yet. The corridor outside had gone quiet, in the particular way hospitals go quiet after violence. Gurneys finally still, monitors settling into their slow, patient rhythm, the overhead lights buzzing faintly against a silence too large for the room. Wren pulled her jacket tighter and let herself, for exactly one breath, feel how tired she was. Then she stood up straight again, because there was still one more shift's worth of night left to survive, and because somewhere behind her, a man who ran half the piers on the Seattle waterfront had quietly decided he wasn't leaving until she did. By the time the last critical patient had been stabilized and moved upstairs, the hospital had settled into the exhausted quiet that only comes after a night violent enough to strip away every pretense anyone had been holding on to. Rhys gathered the remaining staff in the corridor and made his announcement plainly. Wren Solace's suspension was rescinded, effective immediately. Harlan Pike remained suspended, pending a full internal investigation, one that would, by morning, involve considerably more than the hospital board. Wren received her badge back from Isla's hands and clipped it to her scrubs without a word, though something in her shoulders eased. Dorian caught his brother's sleeve where fewer people could overhear.
3 years ago, the note she left in that alley had a string of numbers on it. That same string is what let you avoid the ambush last August. She protected our whole family, and she never even knew our names.
Rhys found Wren outside the locker room a short while later.
3 years ago, my brother lived because of a woman who never asked for a name, he said. Tonight, my whole family is alive because of that same woman.
Wren didn't answer right away. She only nodded once quietly. At 3 in the morning, Wren returned to her small apartment. The street outside was empty in the way a street looks empty right before it isn't. No wind, no passing cars, just the wet shine of streetlight on asphalt, and her own breath fogging faintly in front of her. 2 black cars without plates sat waiting outside, engines idling, low headlights off. 4 men climbed out, no weapons drawn, only closing a slow circle around her. The intention was clear: take her alive. Her mind ran the math it had run 100 times that day for other people's bodies, distance to the door, distance to the nearest light, how many seconds before someone would notice she was gone. For the first time all night, the numbers didn't come out in her favor. One of the 2 drivers gave a small nod toward a dark corner of the street. Rhys stepped out of the shadows unarmed, lifting a phone to his ear and speaking a single sentence. 90 seconds later, both cars' doors opened again, and the 4 men climbed back inside and drove off in silence. Wren let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding since the car doors first opened.
How long have you been standing there?
Since before you walked out of the hospital, Rhys said. I wasn't going to say it and make you feel followed. I was hoping I'd be wrong to worry.
You weren't.
No, he said. I wasn't. Rhys crossed to where Wren stood. I had someone inside their operation since last week, he said. They think they're capturing you. In reality, they're handing themselves over as evidence. The moment the cars disappeared, his phone buzzed. A notification from deep within the city's underground network. The rival family had just placed a bounty across the entire West Coast for the nurse known as Solace. She had just been cleared of every accusation against her, and in the same breath become the single most wanted target in the region. Wren stood in the rain that had followed her through this impossible day, and understood with a clarity that settled cold in her chest that surviving tonight had not been the end of anything. It had only been the beginning of a much larger hunt. If a single phone call being enough to make 2 carloads of armed men simply drive away told you everything about the kind of power this mafia boss commanded, wait until you see what happens when that power is finally used to protect someone he's chosen to keep. Rhys didn't leave her doorstep that night. Rain caught in the collar of his coat, and he didn't seem to notice. "You should have protection," he said.
"I've survived worse without it," Wren said. "Apparently for 3 years without even knowing. That's exactly why you shouldn't have to survive it alone anymore." She studied him for a long moment, the sharp lines of his face, the particular stillness of a man who had spent his whole life being the most dangerous person in every room he entered, standing in a wet stairwell at 3 in the morning, simply because he didn't want to leave.
"Why does this matter to you?" she asked. "Beyond the debt your family owes me." "Because for 3 years I've been hunting a ghost," Rhys said. "Tonight I found out the ghost has a name, a laugh she doesn't let herself use often enough, and a spine stronger than anyone in that hospital gave her credit for. That's not a debt. That's something else." Wren didn't answer, but she didn't step away from him either. Somewhere down the block a car alarm chirped once and went silent, and neither of them flinched, which was in its own small way its own kind of answer. "Get some sleep," he said, finally stepping back into the rain. "I'll have someone at the corner until morning. You won't see them, that's the point." She almost asked him to stay. She didn't say it. But she stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to, watching him disappear down the wet street, and she found she didn't mind being watched over half as much as she'd expected to. In the days that followed, the hospital's internal investigation moved with unusual speed. Harlan Pike's financial records were subpoenaed. Offshore accounts were flagged. The trail led, layer by layer, back to the same rival network that had placed the bounty on Wren's head. Isla, still shaken by everything she'd risked, found herself trusted with more responsibility than before, not out of pity, but because her willingness to tell the truth when it mattered most hadn't gone unnoticed. The night settled into something almost ordinary, though nothing about them truly was. Wren worked her shifts. A car she never quite saw idled somewhere within 2 blocks of her apartment, every night exactly as promised. Rhys called twice, both times about nothing important, both times lasting longer than either of them planned. She found she was starting to listen for a third call before she admitted to herself that she was. What began as one woman's public humiliation had become something neither Pike nor the men hunting her could have predicted, but the price on her head hadn't gone away. Whatever came next would decide whether she'd ever be safe enough to stop looking over her shoulder. 3 weeks passed. Harlan Pike was formally terminated, his offshore accounts frozen, pending a wider federal investigation into the network that had funded him. Harborview's emergency department reopened under independent oversight, its staff working for the first time in years under leadership that valued competence over hierarchy. Wren refused every new title offered in the reorganization. She wanted only to keep working the night shift the way she always had. She told herself it was because the night shift needed her most. The truer answer, one she hadn't said out loud to anyone yet, was that the night shift was the only place in her life that had never once asked her to be someone other than exactly who she was. At the end of one such shift, as the sky outside shifted from black toward pale gray, Rhys appeared alone at the nurse's station, no guards, for the first time since she'd known him. He set a small box down on the counter. The sound of it landing on the counter was almost too quiet to hear, and yet it was the loudest thing in the room. Inside sat the silver ring, cleaned until it caught the light the way it must have decades earlier. Beside it, a copy of her father's birth certificate, and at the bottom, the same small USB drive the janitor had pressed into her palm the morning this all began. "I had it examined," Rhys said, his voice low, steady. The only person who can fully decode what's on that drive is the daughter of the man who encrypted it in the first place. He paused. I don't only want to protect you anymore. I need you. Wren's fingers hovered over the ring before she picked it up, turning it slowly in the pale morning light coming through the station window. It felt heavier than she remembered, a small piece of silver having any right to feel. The numbers on that last note, Rhys continued quietly, match a blood oath your father made with the old Thorne family years before either of us understood what that meant. By saving 57 lives that night, you fulfilled that oath completely without ever knowing it existed. Under the old rules that still govern both sides of this world, you're no longer someone who needs protecting. You've become someone who holds a share of the power itself. An equal, not a dependent. He held her gaze. That's also why the bounty on your name was quietly pulled 2 days ago. Under those same rules, no one is allowed to put a price on an equal. The men hunting you spent 3 years chasing a target. As of this week, that target no longer exists. Only a woman they now have to answer to. Wren let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hand closed around the ring, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound, the far-off hum of the vending machine down the hall, and the soft squeak of a gurney wheel somewhere out of sight. I changed my name at 19, she said quietly. The year my father disappeared. I thought if I buried who I used to be, whatever he owed would stay buried with it. She looked at the ring. I didn't know it would find me again in a hospital hallway. It didn't find you, Rhys said. You were always the one holding the ending. The rest of us just finally caught up to it. Wren never hid because she was ashamed of who she was. She hid because visibility in her experience had only ever led to loss. Every time someone truly saw her, they'd taken something from her. Her father, her old name, her sense of safety. Rhys's box wasn't just an apology or a gift. It was the first time being fully seen felt like being given something back instead of having something taken away. And that's the quiet reason she finally let herself believe it was safe to stop disappearing. From tonight, Rhys said, it isn't me protecting you anymore. If you want it, we hold something together that could dismantle the entire rival network within 6 months. If you want to walk away instead, I'll erase every trace of what happened and let you live an ordinary life. But I will never find anyone like you again. Wren looked at him for a long moment, long enough that a passing orderly slowed his cart without quite meaning to, sensing he'd walked into something he shouldn't interrupt. And for the first time in more years than she could count, she let herself smile without hiding it. I never wanted power, she said. I only ever wanted to be trusted to do my job without someone deciding I didn't deserve to. You have that now, Rhys said. Whatever else you choose, then I choose to keep doing what I've always done, she said. But I won't do it pretending the rest of this isn't real anymore either. He almost smiled at that, a small, unguarded thing that looked out of place on a face built for giving orders in wet stairwells. That's the only answer I was hoping for. The following morning, the small cardboard box that had once been left in the rain outside a hospital exit sat neatly on top of her locker. Inside, the photograph of her father remained undisturbed. Beside it, a new note in Rhys's own hand. Thank you for not letting 57 people pay for a system's cowardice. A small string of numbers sat at the bottom, coordinates this time to the original ledger. The one piece of evidence that could finally end the long, quiet war shaping both their lives. And the key to finding it rested in the hands of the nurse the world had once dismissed as unworthy of standing in the room where lives were saved. Somewhere down the hall, a new shift was starting. A young resident, glancing at Wren's badge, asked one of the senior nurses who she was. That, the nurse said, is the one who saved all 57 victims. The same nurse they suspended that morning, the one the Mafia boss himself stood up for, if you can believe it. The resident looked back down the hall to where Wren was already moving toward her first patient of the day, steady, unhurried, exactly the way she had moved through every hour of the worst night of her life, and understood, without anyone needing to explain it further, that some people only look ordinary right up until the moment everything depends on them. In the end, this story is about the quiet arithmetic so many of us learn too late, that dignity was never something other people had the authority to hand out or take away, only something we forgot we already owned. If you've spent years being underestimated by a boss, a spouse, or your own children, here's something worth trying this week, not someday. Write down one thing you know you're good at. Something nobody ever had to teach you. Put it on the refrigerator where you'll see it every morning with your coffee. When someone dismisses you, you won't need to argue with them out loud. You'll already have the answer sitting right there in your own handwriting. And if you're sitting with this story alone tonight in a house that used to hold more voices than it does now, call one person tomorrow who once told you that you mattered and let them tell you again. Not because time heals anything on its own, but because the people who still remember who you were before the world stopped looking are usually only one phone call away. If Wren's story moved something in you today, tell me in the comments what part of her transformation stayed with you the longest. Share this with someone who needs to remember their own worth. Like this video if you believe quiet strength deserves to be seen, and subscribe because there are more stories like hers still waiting to be told.